Welcome back to Airgun Academy. In our last episode, we went over some of the basics with regard to scope mounts. I also mentioned several specific topics related to scope mounts that require episodes of their own. That's because of the large amount of detailed information you need to fully understand these topics. In this episode, we'll continue our discussion of scope mounts by looking at a couple of common scope bases found on airguns today. We'll look at the two main types of scope bases to which the scope rings or mounts have to attach: the 3/8 inch or 11mm base and the Weaver base. We'll also cover a third type of scope base that you should be aware of: the Picatinny rail. Before we dive into the types of scope bases, I want to briefly define what the word dovetail means. All dovetails resemble the name they're given. They look like the tail of a dove. The airgun dovetail is usually made up of two parallel grooves that run along the top of an airgun spring tube. Sometimes the grooves are not cut into the spring tube because the metal is too thin. Instead, a separate scope base or rail is attached to the top of the spring tube, like on the RWS Diana 48. This external part still forms the dovetail shape we're discussing. Most airgunners believe that airgun dovetails are 11mm wide, but that's not exactly the case. In fact, what we call 11mm airgun dovetails can be anywhere from 9.5 to 14mm in width. Never use discount store Rimfire scope mounts on your airgun. You might think they're okay to use since Rimfire rifles, like airguns, are grooved for scope mounts with similar sized dovetails. The size of the Rimfire dovetail is so close to the airgun 11mm dovetail that scope mounts made for Rimfires will fit on airguns. But discount store Rimfire scope mounts are made too soft for use on recoiling airguns. The result is that they will fall apart very quickly with airgun use. Rimfire dovetails have a 3/8 inch separation, which is extremely close to the airgun width of 11mm. That's why some airgun mount manufacturers label their mounts as usable for either 3/8 inch Rimfire scope bases or for 11mm airgun scope bases. If the mounts are made by a reliable airgun manufacturer, they will be strong enough to stand up to the recoil of a spring piston gun. But if they're made just for Rimfire rifles that have almost no recoil, they'll be very soft and unusable on most airguns. Now, let's move on to the primary focus of this episode: the various types of scope bases. The first of the most common types of scope bases is the one I've been talking about up to this point: the 3/8 inch or 11mm base. It may sound like we're talking about two kinds of scope bases because they're different sizes, but we're not. These two measurements actually constitute just one type of scope base. As you can see, these two measurements differ by only a few hundredths of an inch. And remember, I said that 11mm airgun dovetails actually vary in width by a large amount. For this reason, scope mount manufacturers usually make their mounts to fit both applications. The second common type of scope base is the Weaver base. These bases are of a proprietary dovetail size, which means the size is exclusive to the Weaver company. Weaver first created their mount just before 1950, becoming the first company to provide standardized scope mounts for rifles. During the 1950s and 60s, firearms did not come with scope mount bases. To address this issue, Weaver designed a universal scope mount base, and that design is still very popular today. It has a wide dovetail that's very easy to attach mounts to, and it provides a solid anchor for the scope mounts. The most important feature of the Weaver base is the slot that runs crosswise to the base. These slots accept keys located on the bottom of the scope rings or mounts. The keys are an integral recoil block and keep the scope rings in place when the gun recoils by preventing the scope from moving forward and backward on the base. Today, Weaver mounts are used more on firearms than pellet and BB guns. Although the Benjamin Trail Series hunting rifles come with weaver bases permanently attached to their spring tubes. Weaver bases are ideal for firearms, but they're too wide to accept the standard 11mm airgun rings. In addition, the locations of the cross slots are arbitrarily placed along the base. Manufacturers of weaver bases can place the cross slots wherever they want. For this reason, weaver bases work best with two-piece rings that can be positioned independently of each other. As I mentioned earlier, there's a third type of scope base that you should be aware of: the Picatinny rail. The Picatinny rail or base is the most recent and most versatile of all three base systems. The term Picatinny rail originates in the firearm industry from the US government's Picatinny arsenal. This base is controlled by a military standard, specifically Mil Standard 1913. This rail is the base on all NATO military firearms, as well as some law enforcement ones. It accepts many different kinds of accessories, including scopes. The key to the Picatinny rail or base is the cross slot, that's 5mm wide. These slots are positioned at precise locations that are always the same distance apart. Accessories designed for weaver mounts with their 3.5mm cross keys will almost always fit Picatinny bases that have 5mm cross slots. However, the inverse is rarely true. Once you become familiar with the Picatinny base, its value will be obvious. It truly is the Lego block of the scope-based world. And because airsoft guns are copies of tactical and law enforcement firearms, they often come with Picatinny bases built in. Positioning scope rings is easy with Picatinny bases. Not to mention, just like weaver bases, they resist recoil amazingly well. They resemble a weaver base, but they're not quite the same. For starters, the cross slots on Picatinny bases are 1.5mm wider than those on weaver bases. Also, the cross slots are located at precise intervals along the Picatinny base. But, as I mentioned earlier, the notches are placed arbitrarily on weaver bases. Weaver rings easily fit into Picatinny bases. The problem is that weaver cross keys are smaller than Picatinny cross slots. So, even though they fit, you'll have to position the weaver ring cross key against the back of the Picatinny cross slot. Then clamp the ring firmly in place. The recoil of a spring piston airgun will keep the weaver ring anchored firmly against the back of a Picatinny slot. We covered a lot of ground with this episode, so let's recap what we've learned. We briefly looked at dovetails, and we learned that both 3/8 inch and 11mm dovetails are so close in measurement that the rings made for either one will usually fit both types of dovetails. We also learned that cheap discount store Rimfire dovetails should never be used on airguns because they're too soft to hold properly. We covered 3/8 inch or 11mm scope bases, weaver bases, and the Picatinny rail or base. Of these three, the Picatinny base is the most recent, the most versatile, and the best of the three different base systems. We learned that weaver bases are used more commonly in the firearm world, but they're too wide to fit the 11mm airgun dovetail. Not to mention, 11mm airgun dovetails do not have the cross slots needed to accept the weaver cross keys. We also learned that on weaver bases, the cross slots are arbitrarily placed along the base, so they work best with two-piece rings. We looked at the similarities and differences between Picatinny bases and weaver bases. For example, Picatinny rings will not fit weaver bases, but weaver rings will fit Picatinny bases. Just be aware that weaver cross keys are narrower than Picatinny cross slots and must be positioned with their keys against the rear of the Picatinny slots when viewed from the muzzle. You won't find Picatinny bases on airguns. Even the weaver base is only just beginning to appear on some airguns, like the Benjamin Trail Series rifles. However, if you want to use a set of weaver rings, you can use an 11mm to weaver adapter. But in most cases, you'll want to use the 11mm airgun dovetail mounts. We still have more ground to cover with scope mounts, including scope stop systems, specially machined mounts, and adjustable mounts. So keep on watching for more information about these and other topics. Thanks for watching Airgun Academy. Stay tuned for another great lesson from Pyramid Air.